Every year at COP, we hear the same pledges, promises of billions in climate finance, net zero declarations, a greener, brighter future. The speeches sound inspiring, the pledges sound transformative. But in Africa and the global south, where communities are already living with the sharp edge of climate change, the question is always the same. How much of this is reality? And how much is just a PR gimmick? Today, we explore the promises, the contradictions, and the ways Africans themselves are reshaping the climate narrative. On paper, Africa should benefit the most from climate change promises. The continent contributes less than 4% of global emissions, but faces some of the harshest climate shocks. Persistent droughts in the Horn, floods in West Africa, cyclones in Mozambique, hitting some of the most vulnerable communities in the world. Real climate action would save lives here first. And yet, many green flagship projects tell a mixed story. In Kenya, the Lake Turkana wind farm powers 15% of the country's electricity. A technical triumph. But in the process of making way for this new technology, thousands of people from historically vulnerable communities, from the Rendile, Samburu, and Turkana communities, were displaced and dispossessed of communal lands, often without fair prior consultation on the impacts of the project or compensation for lands handed over for this project. In Morocco, the Noor Solar Complex dazzles international audiences as the world's largest solar plant. But for farmers in drought-prone Dra Tafilalet, the project consumes scarce water, further squeezing livelihoods. These grassroots impacts matter because once a project is showcased on the COP stage, it is locked in as a success story, even when realities on the ground are a little more complicated. Then there's the bigger injustice: climate debt. Rich countries industrialized for centuries have dumped toxic fumes and effluent into the environment, fueling the very crisis we face today. Africa, and the global south by contrast, contributes the least to pollution, yet pays the highest price. Back in 2009, wealthy nations promised $100 billion a year in climate finance to help the global south adapt. But according to the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, less than half of that has materialized, and much of it as loans, not grants. Loans that deepen the burden in countries that are already choking under previous debt instead of easing it. For many African negotiators, this isn't charity. It's owed. It's about fairness. It's about historical responsibility. And increasingly, African leaders are saying so on the global stage.
At the summit, we also made it clear that we are aware of the unjust configuration of multilateral institutional frameworks that perpetually place African nations on the back foot through costly financing, which plunge our economies into debt trap and deny them resources needed to mitigate and adapt in response to climate change, invest in energy transition, and facilitate industrialization to create jobs and wealth, and to reduce inequality.
But outside forces aren't entirely to blame for Africa's climate struggle. There are challenges within too. Corruption, mismanagement, and weak governance make the situation even harder for local populations by undermining the impact of even the few resources that do arrive from donor governments and international organizations. Think of cases of corrupt diversion of adaptation funds through theft, misallocation, and patronage systems, a recurrent concern highlighted by donors, media, and civil society groups throughout sub-Saharan Africa. In many instances, billions earmarked to help in disaster response simply does not pass the audit test, and communities either don't receive help at all or receive less than expected recovery funds. In other cases, disaster responses are slowed not by lack of capacity, but by lack of political will. These internal challenges matter because they shape attitudes, narratives, and beliefs on whether international climate finance and support can actually create concrete change for the vulnerable communities it is intended for. Layered onto all this is corporate power. Africa's oil, gas, and mineral wealth has long been a magnet for global companies. Today, many rebrand themselves as environmentalists while continuing destructive tactics in a practice called greenwashing. The very phrase carbon footprint was coined by British Petroleum (BP) PR campaign in the 2000s that popularized the idea of personal responsibility for pollution. By providing tools like the carbon footprint calculator, which cleverly reframed the responsibility for emissions away from corporations like itself to the general public.
What size is your carbon footprint?
The carbon footprint's there. That I don't know.
Whatever it is, the whole population of the world, make that a very, very big number.
How much carbon I produce? Is that it?
You mean the effect that my living has on the earth in terms of the products I consume?
And it expanded its operations in Angola, Algeria, and Libya. In the Congo Basin, hailed as one of the world's greatest carbon sinks, government and corporate interests still auction off oil blocks in sensitive peatlands. And the so-called green transition is intensifying this scramble. Minerals like cobalt, lithium, and copper, essential for electric cars and batteries, are extracted from African soil, often under harsh and sometimes illegal labor conditions, and with little local benefit. The reality of what we collectively face is that Africa, once again, becomes the resource pit stop for global energy revolution, while its people see few returns. Resistance and innovation are growing. Civil society groups are demanding stronger environmental regulations. Local communities are asserting land rights, and African thinkers are pushing for a new kind of resource governance, one that insists the green transition cannot repeat the injustices of the fossil fuel-driven industrial era. In Kenya, despite past challenges, the government is inching toward a more bottom-up approach to climate action. Through pioneering county-level climate legislation, communities are increasingly gaining a voice in how adaptation funds are allocated, helping to ensure that decision-making rests in the hands of those most directly affected by climate change. In Rwanda, the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy channels funds to create jobs, protect ecosystems, and expand renewable energy. Similarly, Ethiopia's Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy embeds low-carbon development into its growth plans, investing in renewable energy, reforestation, and climate-smart agriculture. These examples show that with coherent policy design, climate action can drive economic transformation. In Senegal, homegrown solutions like solar microgrids are lighting up villages far from the national grid. In Kenya, community water cooperatives blend indigenous knowledge with new tech to manage scarce resources. And across the continent, youth activists are making sure climate justice is framed as both a global and African issue. As another year at COP unfolds, the gap between rhetoric and action will likely remain wide. The central question isn't only whether the world will finally honor its climate pledges, but also whether African and Global South voices, local, diverse, and determined, will shape the global climate story on their own terms. The speeches may echo in global halls, but Africa's real climate story is written every day in its communities, its innovations, and its fight for a just future.